you're all doing well. We're just gonna wait for a few more minutes for everyone to join. And if you want, feel free to also share where you're calling from and also what your intention is for joining the call. We'll just give it 2 more minutes before we start. And for now, if you want to add in the lovely comments chat, I'm seeing people from all over the world. Where are you calling from and what's your intention for today's conversation? All right. Welcome, everyone. So nice to see so many faces. We've got over 100 people joining from, as I'm seeing, all over the world. My name is Moh Al-Haifi, and I'm going to be your host for today's session. And I don't know, Tay, if it's possible to maybe also put the speakers also as a spotlight, that'll be awesome. I'm going to kick right in, and I'm going to also zip it very shortly and give the microphone over to our main 2 speakers today. But first of all, just wanted to say welcome and thank you so much for joining. So today we're incredibly fortunate to have 2 very special guests with us, John Fullerton and Hunter Lovins, both true pioneers in reimagining how our economy can work for people and the planet better. I want to introduce them today just a bit to highlight who they are, what they've accomplished so far, so that we can also introduce them a bit more personally or give you the mic to introduce yourselves a bit more personally afterwards. So Hunter Lovins, you're a lifelong champion of sustainable development. Hunter is the co-founder of Rocky Mountain Institute, president of Natural Capitalism Solutions, where she has helped companies and communities around the world implement profitable and sustainable practices that are truly long-term sustainable. She brings over 30 years of experience as a sustainability thought leader and has written over 14 books. Yes, I was also surprised to find out over 14 books on regenerative business and economics, including co-authoring the influential bestseller, Natural Capitalism, as well as co-authoring the more recent, A Finer Future, Creating an Economy in Service to Life, actually with John himself as well. Her contributions have earned her numerous awards from Time Magazine, even named Hunter a hero for the planet for her work. And Hunter, we're absolutely, and I personally am absolutely thrilled to be talking to you today in this conversation. Joining us as well, next to Hunter, is John Fullerton. John Fullerton is a visionary economist and impact investor, more recently even a bit of a poet. John Fullerton is perhaps most known for as being the architect of regenerative economics and the founder and main facilitator slash host of the Capital Institute courses. He had a successful 20-year career on Wall Street, being part of JP Morgan and Co., and has been listened to a calling to do things quite differently after that past financial career. Over to the both of you now, and really what I'd love to start with and how I'd like to maybe introduce you to our audience today is maybe if you can explain to us who you are through the relationships of places and people that have encountered you over the past and how that's also contributed to your journey into regenerative economics. And we're just going to leave it open to any one of you to answer first.
Ladies first, I would say.
Well, let's see. The place that we met was Boulder, Colorado. I had been part of a thing called the International Expert Working Group created by the King of Bhutan. And in the process of trying to figure out how to reinvent the global economy, the king turned to me and said, "Hunter, that's your job." I went, "Me?" Came back to the U.S., talked with a fellow that I taught with, who is known on Wall Street as Fix-It Rick. He's the guy Citibank called in to deal with their toxic assets. Very bright guy. Said, "Help." And he said, "Sure, but you don't need me. You need a guy named John Fullerton." So I went in search of John. John was speaking in Boulder, and I was going to go. And my husband said, "It's a gorgeous day. Let's go ride the high country." It's like, sit in a conference, ride the high country. And then I thought, oh, it just blew my opportunity. A couple weeks later, quite unbeknownst to me, John was speaking at a conference I was speaking at in Boulder. And literally standing outside, because it was a gorgeous June day, this guy walks up and says, "Hi, my name's John Fullerton." It's like, yes. I spoke, and John sat there and nodded. John spoke. I sat there and nodded. We went down the street to, I believe it was the Oak restaurant, had iced coffee, and agreed that we just had to work together. And
when was this, Hunter, if I may ask?
That was 2012.
Was it really?
So we've been at it for a little while.
Thank you.
I think we're not making enough progress.
No, we're not.
And Hunter, maybe you can also go a bit deeper into even just before that, because what I'm hearing is that's kind of the moment that you met John. But I'm also really curious, and I'm sure the audience is also curious, how, who, better said, led you to the path to that moment?
Well, I'm not sure I had a whole lot of choice. My mother worked in the coal fields with John L. Lewis, took a law degree with Dick Nixon, had 14 careers. My father helped mentor Cesar Chavez, Martin King. They were around the house when I was growing up. So working to make the world a little better than it is today is just kind of what you do. And so I was active in civil rights, fair housing in the 50s, anti-Vietnam War in the 60s, civil rights in the 60s, planted a tree for the first Earth Day, took a degree in environmental studies, took a law degree because I thought law was the way to drive change, found out, thank God for the good environmental lawyers, with perhaps one exception. But law is not going to drive the change that we need. Pivoted, became a forester, got into environmental education. We were planting trees in and around the LA basin to deal with the fact that smog was killing the forests, but it seemed to me smog was a symptom. What was the cause? Energy, misuse, misunderstanding, misallocation of energy. So in 72, I started trying to teach myself energy policy. Tracked from there into Amory Lovins. We were introduced by the chief economist of Atlantic Richfield. We integrated our careers, went to work for our then boss, Dave Brower. We were talking a little bit earlier about Dave's been fired 3 times, and I've been fired 4. Every time I get fired, I ask myself, what would Dave do? He goes and creates a new organization. So Amory and I created Rocky Mountain Institute. When Dave got fired, we got fired. So created Rocky Mountain Institute. Then I got fired from that, created Natural Capitalism, and here we are. got fired recently from place I was teaching, so created COPEX, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
Sure.
What
Thank you.
would
So
Dave do?
what would Dave do? And definitely a trend of getting fired. But I'm also hearing a lot of influence growing up from your parents, both being social activists, and also through the many organizations and also many probably natural ecosystems that you've, physically been in. Thank you so much for sharing, Hunter. John, I'd love to maybe hear your side of the story. What were the key relationships that have led you to today, and also maybe your perspective of getting to know Hunter?
Sure. So, the short version is I've kind of lived two different professional lives. I was sort of a very naive kid when I went to Wall Street, believing that global finance and would be the engine of globalization, and that was the way to lift poverty. And the guy that ran JP Morgan when I showed up went on to run the World Bank, and so that seemed like the pathway to do good things in the world. And it was sort of a strange things happened on the way to the dance kind of a situation. And at any rate, I hung around for 20 years, loved most of it, less and less as time went on. And I guess the best way I describe it is there was just an intuition that said not only was the merger with Chase my opportunity to walk away from that institution, which the culture had been great and I loved it, but it was going to change as a result of the merger. But more radically, I knew I had to leave Wall Street and that whole world. And so I walked away with no idea what I was going to do next. I was 41 years old, and
And when was this from? What year?
2001. And then, again, short version is I experienced 9/11 up close and personal and went into a deep funk and a deep think and discovered that there was this thing called the environmental crisis brewing, and that there was something called complexity science and system science, and read Limits to Growth, and then read Natural Capitalism, and just got enamored with this idea of rethinking capitalism, rethinking economics, because the economy was the water we swim in, and it was the root cause of all of these things we now call the polycrisis. So
Mm,
I've been really good on the diagnosis, not so good on the solution part, I would say.
mm.
Um,
Thank
or
you,
at
John.
least
I
the
think
solution part's a lot harder than I could have ever imagined it would be.
it's
Oh,
definitely
and,
always.
and the only other thing connection to Hunter, she may not know this. In my searching around for answers, I took a trip out to the Rocky Mountain Institute, and slept it was somebody's house. I don't know how I
Ellie
ended up having.
Burke. You did tell me this story.
Did I?
Yeah, landed in a
And
snowstorm and
yeah, it was a huge snowstorm, and I managed to get myself up and hang out with Amory for a few hours, and he was telling me about his banana tree that was inside this building that they had built on the top of a mountain in Colorado. So anyway, that's
Mm.
how I first learned about Hunter, I think.
Makes sense. And what I'm seeing or really feeling here is that there's two very different paths that led you to very close places where you're now. So we're looking at someone growing up as almost this social environmental activist, having been surrounded with that, someone growing up in a financial career path, kind of ending up in the same book. And this is something I'd love to maybe just continue that thread and see how we can explore that more. But you've kind of hinted actually to the next section, which I'd love to dive a bit deeper into, just to help create clarity for the audience. We've mentioned natural capitalism, we've mentioned regenerative economics. Can we maybe just create a little baseline? What is regenerative economics, and what's the difference between regenerative economics and natural capitalism, for example?
Well, regenerative economics is the idea that there is a real thing called regeneration. It's a process that ecologists and living system scientists describe in lots of detail. Fritjof Capra, in his recent paper, distilled life into four principles. The first is that it's networked. The second, that it's inherently regenerative. The third is that it's creative. And the fourth, incredibly, is that it is intelligent. And so, starting from the very big picture, there is this thing called life. There is a whole science to try to understand life. It has evolved way, way beyond Darwin, but most people who run the world have no idea and have not really studied it much. Um, and I think that's at the heart of our challenge. But this regeneration is the process that explains how life works. And so the premise of regenerative economics is that the human economy, made up of human beings that are living systems, the human economy itself is a living system. So if we're going to understand it and design it and govern it and think about how to make it better, we need to study not Newtonian physics, which is the foundation of neoclassical economics, but we need to understand Newtonian physics, understand the law of entropy, but actually learn about how living systems work. And
Mm.
when you think about the economy as a living system, it changes everything. And importantly, it changes how we think about changing it. Because as a living system, it's an organism, not a machine. And so it's not about changing the algorithm or changing the goals or changing the rules alone, although those things are all important. It's about creating conditions for health to emerge out of the living system we call the economy.
Mm.
So there's a quick
Um,
summary.
Thank you, John. And I'll get right back into, I'd love to hear more about your inside view as well of why this neoclassical model is not working, especially in today's kind of world. But we'll get to that in a second. I'd love to hear from Hunter, maybe a bit more. Obviously, you've been thinking about the environment for a long time, and I'm sure the concept of regeneration is nothing new for you. So maybe you can maybe add a bit to that. How has your thinking evolved of what defines a regenerative economy?
It's evolved enormously since working with John. Natural capitalism was a much less ambitious piece of thinking, writing, co-creation. We were simply trying to solve the problems that were right in front of us. Wrote the book. Three of us took the better part of 3 years to write it. Uh, when it was about to be published, we drafted a piece for Harvard Business Review on it, sent it off to them. They wrote back and said, "We don't get it. What are your principles?" Like, principles? Huh. Well, efficiency, resource efficiency, biomimicry, Janine Benyus's work, the circular economy, um, Walter Stahel's work, and coupled with least cost applications. Then Dave Brower's conservation, preservation, restoration. So restoration.
And
Wrote
Hunter,
the
can I stop
paper.
you can I stop you right there? If I'm
Sure.
hearing these words for the first time, could you maybe give me a one-line explainer of each? I know we can spend hours explaining each one of them.
Efficiency. We can cut the, for example, energy we use by 50% cost effectively today. Doing that would solve a great number of the environmental problems facing us. Add in renewable energy, you've solved half the climate crisis. Add in regenerative agriculture, you've largely solved the other half of the climate crisis, all at a profit. The thesis of natural capitalism was this is better business. Interestingly, now, 25 years later, here we are back again. Talking about doing the right thing because it's the right thing has just become unfashionable. So we're back to talking about it's more profitable, which it is. Biomimicry, Janine
Well,
Benyus's
if I can
insight.
interject,
Please.
I would also say that some of it is and some of it is not. And the challenge we have is that we're trapped in this, what's the business case for sustainability argument. And as you just said, Hunter, we're being pushed back into it even harder. In fact, I mean, companies are not even talking about the topic, which is just insanity. But I have zero doubt about the fact that there's going to be an awful lot about doing the right thing that is not profitable. and we need to stop doing a lot of things that is profitable. And
Well,
so
our thesis was, yes, that's true. And do all the stuff that's profitable first because it's profitable because you
yeah,
can make it happen.
Mm.
yeah,
And
and use the
you're at
current
least
system
on
to
the path.
accelerate that. Yeah.
Mm. I love that.
And
Oh.
this is why I say natural capitalism is a much less profound, much less important book thesis than what John is doing. And that's why when we wrote A Finer Future, we wrote it from a very different perspective of really, folks, no kidding, we're in trouble. And what has driven us into the trouble, neoliberalism, is bad history, bad science, and bad ideology. It isn't making anything better off. So we walk through in detail why that's true, and then what should we do? And in A Finer Future, the whole third chapter is regenerative economics. And then flowing from that, how would you then address the problems facing us? There's a whole chunk in there written by Stuart Wallace on values. There's a whole chunk in there written by Anders Wigman on governance. So, when people say, oh, I'm going to get natural capitalism, no, don't. 25 years out of date, there's some stuff in there that's wrong. Finer Future is a much better book. And I'm waiting on John's book. It'll be an even better book. What John has done with regenerative economics is really wholly reframe this debate in the way that it needs to be reframed based on how does nature operate? Not just how does nature do business, how does nature operate? And how can we learn to operate within that? John's 8 principles are foundational. And when I teach uh, sustainable business at Fordham, I start with John's principles and say, we're going to talk a lot about the business case. You're in a business school, fine, but you really need to understand these 8 principles, or
Mm.
everything you do is going to be rearranging deck chairs.
Mm. So it's really what I'm hearing is it's been even an evolution of concepts and solutions that you've been thinking about for the past decades when it comes to circularity, biomimicry, looking at even donut economics frameworks. And what I'm hearing is there's this kind of next step that is becoming a bit more holistic, looking at how does nature holistically function. John, do you have anything to add there around how you see this evolution from ecological economics, if you'd like, or even biomimicry? What is the difference?
So I've actually just written a whole chapter on this subject. So
Timing.
it's complicated and there's a lot of nuance, but the best way I can describe it, and I'm sure I'm still learning. I mean, one thing I would say is that the more I learn, the more confident I am in this idea. It's, I get reinforcement, and I'll just, as one example, and I see Sam on the call here. I've recently become pals with Stu Kaufman, whose book, um, Reinventing the Sacred, I think written in about 2008, was one of my very, profound influences. And Stu is he's one of the early Santa Fe Institute scientists, complexity scientists, a living system, evolutionary biology by degree, also a medical doctor. So he's studying life, not studying machines and physics, but he understands physics. And he's got a new paper out called The Third Dimension in Science, which he's essentially proposing that we're in the midst of a shift from the first transition being Newtonian science, the second being quantum, and the third one being moving beyond quantum, which is essentially, as he says it, accepting the notion that we cannot reduce how life works to math. And there's no physicists generally don't want to hear that. And the reason this is all important and not just theoretical, and this is the key point, is that our economics is grounded in Newtonian physics. it assumes all the modeling we do, all the metrics we do, all of that assumes that we can forecast and predict and measure and adjust as if the economy is a machine. And the same thing happens in business school. We treat businesses, individual businesses, as if they're machines to be optimized. And it's an entirely different way of seeing reality. It's literally like we're in Plato's cave watching a movie on the wall as opposed to seeing reality as it exists. And so it's not a theoretical, abstraction. It's fundamental to understanding why we're in what we call the polycrisis. And I can make the argument that it's fundamental to why we're seeing the rise of extremism and
Mm.
why we're seeing, the not just the ecological crisis, but the divisiveness and the political failures, because our politicians are trapped in that same mechanistic mindset. And now, because there's fear and genuine, crisis happening, we now sort of drop down to our lower base instincts. For those who are familiar with spiral dynamics, we're sort of dropping into red meme territory as opposed to evolving up to more enlightened, more collaborative ways of thinking. So, but the reason that we're being forced into that is that we've mismanaged how we think about the economy. And so we have a machine that is broken, and we're reacting as if our job is to fix the machine, when in fact our reaction needs to be to first see it's not a machine, it's a living organism. And so it's a massive
Mm.
uneducation, re-education challenge just to be able to have the right conversation.
So what I'm hearing is this really reoccurring shift perspective that is really currently happening, and especially with the approach of regenerative economics and the principles. It really does focus on this shift from neoclassical machine-like thinking to living organisms, ecosystemic approach of thinking. So really that shift from we're not fixing a machine, but we're actually fixing something that's closer to our body than is actually closer to a machine. Hunter, could you maybe add a bit more here? So what is a living organism? How do we start to see an economy as something that's living? Like, especially from your perspective, coming from a sustainability, environmentalism kind of background, like, how does that actually look like in practice when we're translating that onto our economy?
I can't say definitively. I'm a student of John's. I'm a student of all of this thinking. So I'm trying to learn how to do this better. Um, I was just writing to Daniel, who posed, how can we have a global economy, that John's principle of honoring place and community would argue we can have, perhaps, if we want it, a global economy, even a global industrial economy, but only if every place has its own integrity. So, how do we begin to see the economy as an organism? I think we start local. The work of Michael Schumann on local economic development, and Moose and I have worked together for years on this. In fact, at Rocky Mountain Institute, we built the Economic Renewal Project. Of course, Moose has taken this on and made it a whole discipline. And if anybody wants to know how to do local economic development in smart ways, in ways with integrity, Michael Schumann, a lot of books, author of the Main Street Journal, which I highly recommend. But thinking about what is my community? What is the integrity of that? What is the nature around me? How can my economy be in integrity with that nature is a good place to start. I don't know how to think. When the king said, Hunter, your job is to reinvent the global economy, it's like, oh, I have no earthly idea how to do that. Still don't. But by starting with your little piece of it, at the same time, as Bucky said, act locally, think globally, how does that little piece relate in ever larger aspects? what's going on at the international level impacting what I'm doing here. We've, of course, built this economy in which, well, we found out in COVID. We even found out when what is the Ever Given got wedged in the Suez Canal. We're all incredibly dependent on stuff moving hither and yon around the planet about which we have no control. What if we started, each of us, gaining a little more control over the economic systems that really matter to us? So, for example, there is a bit of a general strike being called for the 28th of February. Don't buy anything from one of the big global companies. Buy local, support your local businesses, buy eggs from the crazy chicken lady down the street, who increasingly is going to be the source of eggs for all of us. But don't, for one day, don't participate in the global economy. Be interesting to see what happens.
Hmm. Thank you so much, Hunter. And actually, this reminds me, recent blog post I was writing around the intersectionality of colonialism and capitalism and where we're getting now. John, maybe you can continue off with what Hunter has been saying right now. So in terms of how do we start to look at our economy in a more living approach, right? So what I'm hearing from Hunter is maybe we can start local. And someone in the comments even said the bioregional weaving community or movement is also growing now, and something that I've been also witnessing over the past few months and years, especially. Maybe anything to add on that, John, but also then, is there any other kind of element that you'd like to introduce in terms of how we do start to look at our economy?
Yeah. So for sure, the easiest way to dig in and get going is to begin at a local, regional, bioregional scale. And that's not a new idea. I mean, there's been bioregional efforts. Bioregionalism is a thing that's been around longer than I've been thinking about this problem.
Can we have a quick, maybe just explanation of what it is for people who aren't aware?
Well, bioregionalism is thinking about place in the context of both geological reality and cultural reality. So, and there's no, in fact, where is she? Maggie is, I saw my colleague here in our bioregion is on this call somewhere. I don't see her now, but she's written a book on this. But the idea is that life happens in place. And so where a bioregion, like I live in Eastern Connecticut, the bioregion here is a series of rivers feeding into a couple different bays, and the rivers are fed through forests up into New England. And so, you can draw concentric circles around a bioregion. There's no right edge of a bioregion. It's kind of like planet Earth is a bioregion within the universe, and then it goes down from there. But what we find when we study bioregions, as opposed to studying political divisions like states or nations or states or counties, is that the lines we've drawn, political lines we've drawn, have nothing to do with either the ecological reality on the ground or often the cultural reality that exists, that has emerged out of that geologic reality, because the geologic reality influences the culture. So, simple example, if you grow up near the seashore, you have a different culture than if you grow up on a desert climate and context. So the sort of re-seeing human civilization through a bioregional lens is a very powerful way to begin to think about uh, not just the economy, but our entire culture as a living organism, as Daniel Christian Wall has written so nicely. And but I often want to hesitate. Well, and I should say, Samantha Powers has written a book on this recently about how to bring financing into bioregional work, and so that's now very alive and percolating. But my bugaboo, if you will, is to force us to think deeply about this before we rush to action. Everyone wants to act because the world's on fire. And I get that, and I support that, and we need to do that. But what I've realized from thinking about this so long and struggling to communicate it is that if we rush to act before we really process this new way of seeing, this new way of thinking, this holistic, going back to your comment earlier, Mo, it's the most important thing in the course I teach is the shift from reductionist thinking to holistic thinking. And that shift is, you know, we're programmed not to want to make that shift because we've been trained in reductionist thinking for literally 400 years. So I don't know much about epigenetics, but it may have actually influenced the way our genes are passed on. And so we are in the midst of a shift that humanity has never tried to go through before, at least in modern times, which is to not give up our reductionist thinking. It's a brilliant tool. Ian McGilchrist has a great book called Master and the Emissary. The reductionist problem-solving left brain mindset is brilliant for solving problems that are mechanistic in nature. Building spacecrafts, building the internet, building computers, building our house. Those are all brilliant applications of reductionist thinking. So I'm not saying it's bad, but literally our entire quote unquote scientific method is grounded in reductionist thinking. And so I'm not anti-science, I hope people know, but this is a different form of science. And to go back to Stu Kaufman, we're in the process of needing to facilitate emergence to a new way of thinking about the economy. And to quote him in that paper, emergence is not engineering. You don't engineer success in your garden. You create the conditions through healthy soil, and beautiful things happen that you could never anticipate in advance.
Mm.
And so I guess my point is before we rush to implement the regenerative economy, most efforts to implement the regenerative economy end up being the degenerative economy in new clothes. And the regenerative economy is hidden in plain sight. So I would rather help us see what already exists through a new way of seeing than pretend that I know how to manufacture the regenerative economy. And
Mm.
I'll stop talking now, but I'll give an example of that in a minute.
Thank you, John. So, and we'll get to actually the concept of emergence, I think, in just a few minutes. I think what you've both touched upon just in the past few minutes is also like how it's really relevant today, right? How it's really relevant currently, especially because there's a rise of or a longer list of names that we can even come up with on the amount of crises that we're going through at the minute. I guess my question is, how are we seeing proof on maybe recent politics? And you touched upon that, John, around the migration crisis, the left versus right crisis that we're currently facing, but also from an environmental crisis. Hunter, I'd love to hear your thoughts here too. So whoever wants to start, maybe just addressing why it's not working and how there's evidence right now.
That's easy. Just look out the window, read the newspaper.
There are a lot of
Well,
things that are not working, but there are a lot of things that are working.
and maybe
In
Hunter, maybe just before you go, one important thing, as John, you just said that, I think it's important for, or what I really want to understand is the link to regenerative economics, right? So not what's
Yeah,
not working today, but like what isn't working that we're actually addressing with this.
yeah.
the we're in an interesting situation where the house is on fire and there's a burglar coming in the bottom window. We we have got to deal with the house is on fire, but while we're at it, why don't we drop a flower pot on the burglar and solve that problem so that we're not looking at two problems at once? There is much we can do, bearing in mind the regenerative principles. And John briefly mentioned his course. Highly, highly, highly recommend. Any of you who have not taken the course, do so. Many of my students have done this. Not a one has come back and said, boy, that was a waste of time. Every one has said, this is life changing. Thank you so much for recommending it. So take John's course. If we bear these principles in mind, if we take time each day to take a little bit of quiet time and ask ourselves, is what I'm doing the right thing to do right now? Then I would urge act. I'm a big fan of a saying that came out of California of dot. Do one thing every day. Ask yourself, what's my dot? What am I going to do today to make a difference? And you can do both at the same time. But don't become, oh, I'm just going to sit and contemplate and the world will be fine. No, it's not. There's a burglar coming in the bottom window and the damn house is on fire. And we know how to solve the climate crisis. So while we are contemplating these larger things, let's at least get on with solving the climate crisis.
Well, and to your point, Hunter, we learn by our acting. So it's a feedback loop. It's not at all an academic exercise, but my bias is to encourage us to, all we have to do is acknowledge how bloody hard this is to retrain our brain to think in a different way. And by the way, this is intuitive. Like this is celebrating intuition and imagination rather than analytics. This is, in a sense, STEM education is great for certain things, but it's dreadful for what's more important. And so we need to hold both of these. It's not anti-STEM education, but it's we need to, re-energize our creative intuitive capability that we've intentionally degraded and debased and discouraged, and don't celebrate, don't well, that's not true. We celebrate it, but we celebrate it as like it's not serious relative to the economy. I think it's the most profound thing there is about the economy is our intuition and our creativity.
Hmm. So really what I'm taking out of this is dot, do one thing today. Especially around the climate crisis. We have the solutions. I think you mentioned them at the start: energy efficiency,
Yeah, get your
renewable
solar panels
energy,
up.
energy suction out of the air. It's really not
Put a heat
that
pump on.
good a
Yeah.
heat.
My husband for years, look, we have a perfectly functioning gas furnace. Why should we spend the money to get a heat pump? And I finally, when I got annoyed enough at the damage that the fracking is doing everywhere, I said, we are goddamn well going to put a heat pump on. And the gas furnace was getting on towards dying. So he said, all right, all right. A month later, he came, he said, who was that idiot who said we shouldn't have a heat pump? It's the house is more comfortable now. Our cost has gone down. It's like,
Yeah.
well, go have a chat with that idiot and have a chat with the idiot next door. We all delay doing the things we know we should do, from going to the gym to eating less sugar to blah, blah. Do it. Do one thing every day. Pick one and do it.
And John, I'd love to get your input here because what I'm hearing from Hunter is, the burglar's coming in. That's the climate crisis. Let's make sure the burglar doesn't kill us. Let's do one thing fast to avoid that. I guess I'm thinking about the other elephant in the room because I'm feeling like there's two burglars here, which is what I'm witnessing, I think, from a geopolitical point of view. So many people are doubting the next world war. I'd love for you to maybe address that, John, and how that has any connection with the regenerative economics.
Yeah. So, well, let me talk about one very concrete thing that is, again, one of the things about holistic thinking is there are no simple cause and effect. Simple cause and effect is Newtonian. Complexity is multiple interconnected causes and effects that we don't even understand how to trace to the causes. And we may not, and we won't be even aware of what the causes were. But let me just talk very concretely about one, which I think is very much at the heart of the rise of certainly Trumpism in the United States, and that is trade. We have run the world on a theory of trade that is fatally flawed and has had disastrous consequences. And that theory of trade has nothing to do with liberals versus conservatives. It dates to I always forget names. I'll think of it in a second. But it's the law, the quote unquote law. Someone in the chat will help me out. The law of comparative advantage.
David Ricardo.
David Ricardo. Thank you. So 18th century economist, neoclassical economist. The one thing you need to know about economics is that the models are all derived or are all a function of the assumptions you put into the models. There's a great joke about three guys stranded on a desert island, and they all try to open this can, and the priest says, "Don't worry, I can fix this," and he goes and prays, and the can't open the can, and then the engineer says, I'll work on this. And he comes back, I can't open the can. And so they hand it to the economist. And the economist says, no problem. Assume a can opener. And so, but assumptions are really, really profoundly important and get no attention generally when we think about economic policy. And so the assumption of globalization from, I'll just speak from an American perspective, from Ronald Reagan to probably even Jimmy Carter. I don't know. It'd be interesting to look, but certainly Ronald Reagan, Clinton, two Bushes, Obama, Biden, everyone, frankly, except Trump, was that we accepted this idea of comparative advantage, which meant that more trade is good. More trade will lift all boats. And very briefly, the idea that Ricardo had is that, if the French are really good at making wine and the Brits make really nice wool sweaters, it's in both countries' advantage to trade between each other wine for sweaters. But the assumption,
if I can
no,
interrupt,
I'm not done. I'm not done.
Ricardo was explicit.
Yeah,
that
I'm not
this,
done.
Go ahead.
But the key assumption is that the Brits would never invest their capital in France, because why would you trust the French with your capital? And vice versa. So the assumption was that capital would not cross borders. Well, we live in a world where capital freely flows across borders with a click of a button. And so comparative advantage turned out to be competitive advantage. And on the premise of comparative advantage, economists, and Wall Street sold us a narrative that this would be good for everyone because it would lift all boats and we'd have cheaper stuff, so we'd have more pleasure and more money to do more stuff. But no one looked seriously about what would actually happen with the finance algorithm driving this super efficiently to its logical conclusion, which is that we would gut the manufacturing base out of the United States. And so we totally screwed people over, selling them a bill of goods. And this has nothing to do with liberals versus conservatives. Everyone sold us a bill of goods because we built it all on a foundation of neoclassical economics, which was flawed. So we need to rethink the whole idea of trade. And one of the principles in living systems is balance. This is not a principle like John's opinion. This is like a description of how life works. And one of the big ahas for me was that what balance means on multiple different levels and many different contexts. But one of them is from empirical studies of living systems, they balance efficiency and resiliency. And so by definition, if you're optimizing efficiency, which is what economics and finance does, you're not balancing resiliency. And resiliency and I talk about trade, same thing for the global trade supply chains that have become super efficient but very brittle. Germany was dependent on one pipeline to Russia for most of their energy. That is like complete insanity as a living system. Forget about, whether Russia's a good guy or a bad guy. It's just insanity from a resiliency point of view. So if we rethink the basic premise of whether we're trying to manage this complexity of a living organism and work and dance with it, or we're trying to optimize a machine, and study what those first principles are, then we would stop making these really stupid mistakes. But now, as a result of that, we've gutted the middle class in the United States. There pretty much is no middle class in the United States. Half of our country is living from paycheck to paycheck if they have one. Probably it's more than half of this country. They've been traumatized, they've been screwed over, they've been sold a bill of goods, and they're pissed for good reason. And so someone comes along and says, I can give you cheaper eggs. And by the way, the cheap eggs are another example of pursuing efficiency with an industrial agricultural system. The reason eggs are expensive, and by the way, they've shot up, as you all know, since Trump was elected, is because we have an industrial agriculture system that's completely exposed to bird flu. Has nothing to do with whatever Biden did or didn't do. But but now we've got some opportunists in that are selling us an entirely different narrative for lots of different reasons, self-serving and otherwise. And so we're in deep trouble as a result of economic theory.
Yeah, Ricardo was explicit that this only works, comparative advantage, if capital is locally bounded, which is to say you have governance. Back to Anders Wigman, who is on this call, one of the great thinkers of this whole realm, that we need to rethink our governance structures in light of everything that we've been talking about. And the the interesting thing about the bird flu, it turns out not to hit as hard with cage-free eggs, truly cage-free eggs, regeneratively grown chickens. This came out when I consulted for Unilever back when Unilever was really actually serious about these issues. Bird flu hit before. The CEO of North American Unilever was like, I never thought I was going to spend my days worrying about where to get eggs, which of course go into Hellmann's mayonnaise. But he said, it's interesting. You keep talking about regenerative. And in fact, I one night put him and John together for a lovely dinner. He said, we made a commitment to cage free. We're actually able to get eggs better than our competitors. Surprise. When you start implementing these principles in everything that you do, whether it's growing a chicken or running a company, a lot of things start to work better. Ray Anderson, the great industrialist, who was one of the very first corporate leaders to embrace this, Ray and I were sitting together at a conference in 2001, and Ray was annoyed. He said, this isn't why I'm doing it, but everything I'm doing for sustainability is enhancing every aspect of shareholder value. When Ray said to one of his designers, make me a carpet that is made out of recycled material and is itself recyclable, the designer said, boss, it can't be done. Ray said, it has to be able to be done. This is what nature does. So the designer got with Janine Benyus and they went outside. Janine says, you can't do biomimicry inside. Go out, be in nature, pose the question, and see what answers you get back. They designed a carpet based on how leaves fall onto the forest floor. I was there when the designer brought the product back. His eyes were this big. He said, God must be an environmentalist. I said it couldn't be done. When we did it, the resulting product was cheaper, worked better, and had a whole lot of attributes we never thought of. And that's why this kind of thinking is so critical. And
But
again,
let me
take John's course and actually learn how to do this.
Yeah,
let
and
me
John, before you go,
quickly
I'd love.
add one thing to that. And Janine is one of my teachers and definitely would agree with this. It is not just about mimicking nature. It's about participating with nature. We are part of nature. The indigenous cultures all understand that they don't even have a word for nature, at least most of them. They only have language that says, you know, my relationship with the tree or my connection to the river. There's not a there's no way to objectify nature when you're a part of it. Um, and so it's a complicated thing to really process clearly. And if we're all running around designing stuff by looking at nature for ideas, that's great. But that's very different than, again, to quote Janine, life creates conditions conducive to life. So we need to learn what creating conditions conducive to life means in the context of an economy.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I'm just seeing we're almost coming to an end of the session, and what I'm feeling like there's so many rich points we could go into even deeper. But I'd love to maybe end on this one note. So what I'm sensing overall is we're in trouble. There's a lot of research that's been done. We know kind of what to do. We just need to start doing it. And we have principles that help us live in relationship to nature, with nature, be nature, and learn how these patterns and principles can actually be applied on systems like our economy. I guess my question, Hunter, I remember you mentioned this actually in a past episode that I've heard before, which was around how actually, in your point of view, you would make the case that regenerative economics is more profitable under one condition, that it brings the highest return of investment over time. And we've kind of forgot that time element. I don't know if you want to just quickly explain what you meant with that, and then maybe also pass over to John. And I'd love to get your point of view as well, John, around where does degrowth fit in this regenerative economics paradigm?
We've become fixated again because of the neolibs and indeed the oligarchs on Wall Street with measuring everything in quarters. First quarter, second quarter, fourth quarter, and you have to show increased profitability each quarter or you're not a good CEO. Paul Pullman said when he came on at Unilever, he said, no, we're not going to do that. If you think I can best manage your asset on a 90-day rotation, I don't want you as my owners. And over the time that Paul was at Unilever, he steadily grew stock value. He was then taken out by the predatory investors who wanted to raid the company for short-term advantage. Same thing happened at Kraft Heinz. Same thing has happened at a number of companies. What's the one thing you can do about this? If you have money invested in public companies, invested in companies that don't do that. There are a whole lot of ways of investing your money, even in public companies, of course, in private equity, in ways, in outfits that look at longer term return, that look at durable return. There are in Japan 1,000-year-old companies. They tend to be family owned. They're not stock owned because our stock mentality, and we don't, many of us own stock. We own fractions of a second worth of ownership of stock that's traded furiously. As John once said, tax all of those transactions and then use the money from that FTT, financial transaction tax, to begin addressing some of these bigger term problems. Again, this is a problem we know how to solve.
But that's a great example. I went down to the Obama, Treasury Department arguing that when it became fashionable to be able to talk about it post-financial crisis. And the knuckleheads look at me, and they all used to work at Lehman. Why would we do that? That would harm efficiency of our markets, and our efficient markets are our greatest asset. So again, until you shift, and this I did see in the chat earlier, someone mentioned Dana Meadows' um, places to intervene in a system. Uh, Dana was a good friend of Hunter's. I never got to meet her, but
Oh, you would have loved her. She would have loved you.
but her big idea of that places to intervene in the system is that there's all these things we need to do to shift systems, but the very top of the list was the paradigm within which the system exists. And the paradigm within which our economy exists is the Newtonian paradigm. And even, well, I won't go down that rabbit hole.
You know that places to intervene in a system emerged on my whiteboard. One of my members of my board of directors was arguing why NAFTA would be so great because it would increase value, meaning financial value for the oligarchs. And Dana argued against it, and he said, you can't change a system. And she said, yes, you can, and went up and sketched that out. And I actually have the dialogue back and forth between Dana and
Mm.
our research team digging into the details of that. She then wrote it up. Her book, Thinking in Systems, was written when she died. She died, by the way, because she caught the flu and didn't slow down. Note to self, you're no good
Mm.
to anybody if you don't take care of yourself.
If you're
It
dead.
went into encephalitis and she fell into a coma and died.
Mm.
Great, tragic loss.
Mm.
Diana Wright, who had worked with her, was going through Dana's papers and found the manuscript, brought it to me, and said, I think this deserves to be published. Her
Mm.
then publisher had said, nobody would read this. And I read it, edited it, and it was published as Thinking in Systems. If you want to learn systems thinking, that's the book.
But let me add one point to it that's not on her places to intervene in the system, which is what I learned working on the grasslands with Alan Savory and colleagues. And that is that to change a system, you need two things. You need to create pressure, and and we need to allow Hunter a moment to talk about COPEX. Any movement, any agitation, any activism is pressure that helps shift the system. But the other thing is that disturbance. We in the regenerative space talk about disturbance and intentionally creating disturbance. So in the context of the grasslands, the Savory people move a whole bunch of animals in a tight herd together, just like the buffalo roamed, and disturb the soil in order to facilitate regeneration. A forest fire is a disturbance. And so on my sunnier days these days, I look at the whole Trump thing happening and I say, well, you know what? The truth is, we needed a disturbance. I mean, Hunter's been working on this for most of her lifetime. I've been
Long
working
enough that if I were any damn good, we'd have solved
on
these problems.
I've been thinking about it and working on this since I left Wall Street, and we haven't made any real shift. And that's because the system is so locked in. It's very, very difficult to shift the system. But a disturbance like this, for better and for worse, is going to shift, has has created the opportunity to shift the system.
Mm.
And there's no one running for president that could have created a disturbance like this. And so if you want to make lemonade out of lemons, I truly believe that this something like this is actually a positive, as horrible as it is in the way it's being rolled out, and as dangerous it is in the way it's
Mm.
being rolled out. But it was also super dangerous to stay locked in the system as it was before. So this is
Mm.
our opportunity. I truly believe that.
It's this short-term disturbance really that is also part of the process of life, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
Um,
And short term, it could be 5 years, it could be 15 years. That's
mm,
still short term.
yeah. And maybe just to finish us off, as I know that there's, and this might have been already part of what you were just talking about, John, and I think this is a great opportunity for you also to mention COPEX from yourself, which is, if you had to actually end this session with giving a piece of hope, something that's inspiring you, something that has inspired you for the past few months the most, what is it that you can share with us?
About 3, 4 years ago, I was going to quit. I was going to hang up my spurs. I had had a small amount of money without notice land in my bank account from some stock options I had. And my husband started saying, why don't you retire? And I thought, look at everything I've ever done. Is it enough? No, we're losing. Do I know what enough is? No. Then why go down the road? Why burn carbon? Stay home, ride my horse, watch an eagle fly. So I said, I will. I went on one last trip, encountered a guy I had fought several years before, very senior UN official. He gave one of the best speeches on regenerative agriculture I'd ever heard. And I walked up to him and said, howdy, my name's Hunter Lovins. He laughed. He said, I know who you are. Like, yeah, after 2 years of my insurgency. I said, I may have been wrong about you. and we sat down and talked, and he pitched me on an idea: create a global citizens movement to solve the climate crisis by enabling, empowering everyone everywhere in their own community to implement what they can in their own way, not tell them what to do, not be in charge, but empower them. I thought that would be enough. And then I thought, it's too big. I have no earthly idea how to do it, nor do I know anybody who could. You take the usual suspects, and Al Gore, Christiana Figueres, Greta Thunberg, they'd make it about themselves. And this cannot be about a leader. The guy and I wound up spending a lot of time together, and somewhere in the middle of Italy, I thought, son of a gun, he can do it. It isn't about him. And then he looked at me and said, will you join me? And I said, I will ride for your brand. You've no earthly idea what I just said, but you'll figure it out. For a cowboy, it means I'm all in. And so the idea was we would raise 2 million, 5 million, 30 million. People have told us different amounts. Do big bang events, main stage, every continent, artists, celebrities, musicians, celebrating what ordinary people are doing in their communities and make this visible everywhere. $10.5 billion went into the US election, and I was unable to raise the catalytic funding. After the election, he said, launch. Just launch. And I said, yes, sir. And so we are. Here is how you can be a part of it: www.copx.global. Go to the site, register, join us. And then a piece just came out in Climate and Capital Media describing what this is, why we're doing it. Again, we know how to solve the climate crisis. Let's at least put the fire out in the house. We cannot deal with all of the polycrisis if our house is on fire. Mm-hmm. And this is existential. We solve the climate crisis, or all the rest of this is academic.
Yeah.
And we can do that in short order. Again, you couple renewable energy and fossil emissions with regenerative agriculture, pull the excess carbon out of the air, put it back in the soil where it belongs. Estimate from some folk at Tufts, 60 to 100 years, we get back to 300 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. We have solved the climate crisis. So let's do it. Do one thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing to do. And I also just honestly, Hunter, want to echo something you said there along the way, which is, one of the things I really love about you, which is that everyone talks about collaborate, blah, blah, blah. And then they go off and compete. And it's all about them, and it's all about the likes, and it's all about the this, that, and the other thing. And, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Hunter, but, you've ruffled a few feathers along your journey. You're not particularly good at suffering fools, but when Hunter says no one person can do this, we need to collaborate, she actually walks that talk. And I've met her partner in this, and I can tell from a Zoom conversation that he does too. And I think that alone will make this different than all of the other, let's go do this, let's have a big tent and we'll all collaborate, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't turn out that way. So, and by the way, collaboration as opposed to individualism is exactly the regenerative process. It's like, 101 of how living systems work.
I love that. 2 takeaways from this session today. Do the one thing that's going to help solve the fire that's outside, and maybe try to collaborate and not compete. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time and for your conversation. This has been a super rich talk for myself. I've learned a lot. John, maybe just as an ending, if you'd like to just share really quickly what the opportunity is for people who are interested to go a bit deeper into the principles of regenerative economics. What's the next point there?
Yeah, and if I can just also briefly respond to your question about what's keeping me hopeful. And I saw in the chat there were people talking about this, but I don't have the actual data, but I would suspect 70% of the people that show up in our course are women. And I just had a conversation with an amazing woman yesterday who was reorganizing food systems on an island one of the Jersey Islands off the coast of France. And it's not a coincidence to me that it's not that men are dumb and don't get this, but there is a correlation between female energy, female wisdom, female knowledge, female ways of thinking, feminine ways of thinking, I should say, and rebalancing the way we operate in the world. And so I could tick off 25 women, mostly 20 to 40, who totally get this. They don't need to take the course. They just do this intuitively. And if I had my druthers, we would simply have this massive men get out of the way and hand over the keys to the feminine women, feminine wisdom. And I think I feel that that's happening, even though it doesn't show up yet in the world that's dominated by, you know.
With a caveat, you mentioned my partner in COPEX. He's the one who brought climate justice to the United Nations back in the early aughts, gave it to Mary Robinson, who then made a career out of it. And he had this feeling of, huh. They were at a panel together, and a woman said just what you just said. We need women to run the world. And Mary reached over, took his hand, held it up, and said, here is the man who brought climate justice to the UN.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
need us both.
But that
I can't
wasn't
imagine
that.
doing this work without you, John.
Well, but that's why I emphasize feminine energy, not female, per se. So, but it
That's
just so happens that I think feminine energy happens more naturally in women than it does in men, particularly men trained in the West to be competitive beasts. Um, so,
Thank you. So really,
but
it's
to answer your other question,
I saw someone wrote yin yang, which I like.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
again, it's balance. It's just that we're so far out of balance. We need to shift the other way. So we need resilience and we need feminine energy from where we stand. But ultimately, it's about balance. Um, and to answer your other question, it's not a coincidence, but we just so happen to be starting another cohort of the course March 4th. There's tons of information on our website, capitalinstitute.org. I'm particularly heartened when people join the community and then take the course a second or a third time. I said at the beginning, over 2 years ago when we started, that the community was the curriculum, and I didn't have any idea how true that is. But I was at our local bar having dinner last night and met a guy, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him, and he's sounds like he's going to join the course. And I told him, I said, the reason to join is because of the people that are there. And it's almost 2,000 people now from something like 80 countries. And they're doing all kinds of cool stuff together. And so, they're finding dots to do together. And in fact, I'm aware of one romantic relationship that's emerged out of the course too. So you never know.
No promises made.
And
Thank
I
you so much.
predict there's more than one. I just only know about one.
Awesome. Well, I've also seen some people are asking in the chat how you can get to the link to that. Like John said, you can go to Capital Institute's website. You will also be receiving an email after the session for more information if you are interested, and if it does energetically draw you. And with that, I think this is a good moment to close. I am aware that we've been sitting 15 minutes or keeping people 15 minutes longer than expected. Thank you so much for everyone who joined. And again, John and Hunter, it's been a pleasure. And
Moh, thank you.
last
And
words.
Thank you,
John, thank
Moh,
you for all that you do.
for coordinating this. And Moh is a lot more than just a host of conversations. He's part of this community and has launched a company that is on a mission to figure out what regenerative marketing might look like, which is an interesting challenge. So very much part of our community and great to have gotten to know you over the years. And the last thing I neglected to say just briefly is that There are scholarships available for the course. Our intention is to ensure that no one chooses not to take the course because of financial constraints. It is a time commitment. It's 8 weeks, 2 hours twice a week, 2 hours or an hour and a half and 2 hours twice a week. It's all recorded, but the energy is very much if you're a live participant. So people tend to try to be live, but if you can't, that's fine too.
Awesome.
And the
Thank
course
you.
is just an opening into this. It's just the beginning. So thanks everyone for showing up.
Have a lovely day, evening, night.